Welcome back to the VybeShift Podcast. I'm Paul Shepardson. Today I'd like to begin with a question. When was the last time you completely trusted yourself? Not when someone else approved, not when everything worked out, not after you gathered enough evidence to convince yourself you were right. I mean, when was the last time you simply knew? When was the last time you made a decision that came from somewhere deep inside you, and you didn't spend the next 3 days wondering whether you made a mistake? Because if you're anything like many of the people I speak with, you've probably noticed something. You second guess yourself. You replay conversations. You research decisions long after you've already made them. You ask 5 different people for their opinions. You look for reassurance. You search for certainty. And even after all of that, you still aren't convinced. It's exhausting. What's especially confusing is that you may actually be very competent. You solve problems at work. People come to you for advice. You've raised children, built a career, managed responsibilities. Others trust you. Yet somehow you don't trust yourself. And that's a deeply painful experience because it creates a quiet divide inside of us. Outwardly, we may appear capable. Inwardly, we often feel uncertain. Eventually, every decision begins to carry more emotional weight than it actually deserves. What if I chose wrong? What if I regret it? What if there's a better opinion? What if I disappoint someone? What if this changes everything? Over time, decision-making begins to feel less like freedom and more like danger. Many people assume that this means they're becoming anxious or indecisive or weak. But what if that's not actually what's happening? What if your uncertainty isn't evidence that you've lost your ability to choose, but evidence that you've slowly lost your relationship with the one person making the choice, yourself? I think that this is one of the quiet tragedies of modern life. Many of us have become incredibly informed, while becoming increasingly disconnected from our own inner knowing. We've learned how to gather information. We've learned how to compare options. We've learned how to optimize. We've learned how to avoid mistakes. But somewhere along the way, we stopped listening inwardly. Instead, we learned to consult everyone else first. Parents, teachers, bosses, experts, friends, algorithms, reviews, podcasts, books, social media, search engines. None of those things are inherently wrong. Wisdom can absolutely come from the outside of us. The problem begins when every outside voice becomes louder than our own. Eventually, we stop asking, what feels true, and begin asking, what would everyone else do? Or perhaps even more honestly, what decision is least likely to disappoint someone? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything, because once your decision becomes organized around avoiding disapproval instead of expressing alignment, self-trust slowly begins to disappear. Not overnight, not dramatically, but one small decision at a time. You begin overriding little nudges, ignoring quiet intuitions, suppressing your own preferences, choosing what is expected instead of what feels deeply authentic. After enough repetitions, you begin believing something that was never actually true. I can't trust myself. But here's something worth considering. Maybe you've never actually stopped trusting yourself. Maybe you've simply spent so many years trusting everyone else's voice first that your own has become difficult to hear. There's a profound difference between those two experiences. One says something is broken. The other says something has simply become quiet. And quiet things can be heard again. That's where I believe hope begins. Not in becoming someone new, but in remembering the relationship you've always had with yourself before life became so noisy. Because beneath the doubt, beneath the overthinking, beneath the endless searching for reassurance, there is still a deeper wisdom quietly waiting. It has never been trying to control your life. It has simply been waiting for you to listen. In part 2, I'd like to explore why we lose self-trust in the first place, why so many intelligent and compassionate people become disconnected from their own inner authority, and why this experience is far more common than most people realize. In part 2, we'll explore the hidden architecture of self-doubt, how people gradually outsource their inner authority without realizing it, and why rebuilding self-trust begins long before making better decisions. Why do I doubt every decision I make? Before the break, I suggested something that may have sounded surprising. Maybe you haven't lost the ability to trust yourself. Maybe you've simply spent so many years trusting everyone else's voice first that your own has become difficult to hear. I'd like to stay with that idea for a few minutes, because I don't believe self-trust usually disappears through one dramatic event. More often, it fades through thousands of ordinary moments. Think about childhood. Most of us weren't asked, what feels deeply true to you? We were asked, what are you supposed to do? We learned very early that approval often followed compliance. We learned to read the room, to anticipate expectations, to notice what made adults smile and what made them uncomfortable. That wasn't weakness, it was adaptation. As children, adaptation is often wisdom. It helps us belong. It helps us stay connected. It helps us feel safe. The challenge is that many of those adaptive patterns quietly follow us into adulthood. We become experts at reading everyone else while becoming strangers to ourselves. Maybe you've noticed this. Someone asks where you'd like to eat. Your first thought isn't, what sounds good to me? Instead, it's, what would everyone else prefer? Someone asks your opinion. Before answering, your mind quickly scans the room. How will this land? Will anyone disagree? Will this create conflict? You receive a job opportunity. Instead of asking, does this align with who I'm becoming? Your mind asks, what will people think if I say no? Notice how subtle that is. The questions themselves quietly reveal where our authority has been placed. When our decisions are organized around acceptance, our inner voice gradually becomes quieter. Not because it disappears, but because it stops being consulted. Then something fascinating begins to happen. We start believing our uncertainty means we lack wisdom. But uncertainty often isn't the absence of wisdom. Sometimes it's simply the collision between two different guidance systems. One voice asks, what feels true? The other asks, what will keep everyone comfortable? One voice invites congruence, the other seeks approval. One emerges from your deepest values, the other emerges from years of conditioning. No wonder decision-making feels exhausting. Many of us aren't choosing between two options. We're choosing between two identities. The identity we've practiced and the person we've slowly become. That creates tremendous internal tension because the familiar identity promises certainty. Stay the same. Keep everyone happy. Don't disappoint anyone. Don't make waves. Don't risk criticism. The emerging self whispers something entirely different. Be honest. Be authentic. Be aligned, even if it feels unfamiliar. Even if not everyone understands. Even if your voice shakes. That whisper is rarely loud. It doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't argue. It simply waits. This is one reason awareness can initially feel so uncomfortable. Once you begin recognizing these competing voices, you can't unsee them. You'll notice yourself saying yes when your heart quietly says no. You'll notice yourself explaining your choices long after they needed explaining. You'll notice yourself asking permission for things that don't actually require permission. And at first, that awareness can feel discouraging. You may wonder, have I really been living this way all these years? Perhaps. But awareness isn't a verdict. It's an invitation. Because you cannot change what you cannot see. The moment you recognize these patterns, something important begins happening. You're no longer completely identified with them. You're becoming the observer. You're beginning to notice the difference between inherited reactions and authentic responses. That distinction changes everything because self-trust doesn't return through force. It doesn't come from becoming more confident overnight. It doesn't arrive because you finally stop making mistakes. Self-trust begins returning the moment you become willing to hear yourself again. Not your fears, not your conditioning, not everyone else's expectations, yourself. That relationship, more than any perfect decision, is what we're really rebuilding. In part 3, I'd like to explore what rebuilding self-trust actually looks like in everyday life. Why trusting yourself doesn't mean becoming certain, and how learning to listen inward again may become one of the most transformative relationships you'll ever restore. In the final part, we'll bring the conversation into practical daily life, showing listeners that self-trust isn't the absence of doubt, it's the willingness to remain aligned with themselves even when certainty never arrives. Part 3. Why do I doubt every decision I make? As we come to the end of today's conversation, I'd like to leave you with one thought that has profoundly changed the way I understand self-trust. Trusting yourself does not mean never experiencing doubt. Read that again in your own heart, because I think many of us have quietly created an impossible definition of self-trust. We imagine that if we truly trusted ourselves, we would always know exactly what to do. We'd never hesitate. We'd never feel uncertain. We'd never second guess a decision. Life would unfold with complete clarity. But that's not life, and it's certainly not growth. Every meaningful season of growth contains uncertainty. Every new beginning asks us to walk into territory we've never explored before. Every authentic decision carries some level of risk because authenticity always asks us to leave behind something familiar. So perhaps the goal isn't to eliminate uncertainty. Perhaps the goal is to become someone who can walk through uncertainty without abandoning themselves. This is a very different way of living. Think about the people you admire most. They aren't necessarily the people who always know the right answer. They're often the people who remain deeply connected to who they are, even when the outcome is unknown. They make mistakes, they change direction, they learn, they apologize, they grow. But through it all, they remain in relationship with themselves. That's what self-trust looks like. Not perfection, relationship. And every healthy relationship grows through consistent attention. You don't rebuild trust with another person through one grand gesture. You rebuild it through thousands of small moments where your actions become congruent with your words. The same is true with yourself. Every time you honor a quiet inner knowing, even when no one else understands, you strengthen that relationship. Every time you stop seeking permission to be yourself, you strengthen that relationship. Every time you choose alignment over approval, you strengthen that relationship. Every time you tell yourself the truth instead of the story that keeps everyone comfortable, you strengthen that relationship. Little by little, decision by decision, conversation by conversation, you begin discovering something beautiful. The voice you thought had disappeared was never actually gone. It was patiently waiting beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the expectations, beneath the endless habit of asking everyone else who you should become. Eventually you realize something that changes everything. The question was never, can I trust myself? The deeper question has always been, am I willing to listen? Because your deepest wisdom doesn't usually shout. It whispers, it invites, it nudges, it waits. And perhaps today, for the first time in a long time, you'll choose to pause before asking someone else what they think. Perhaps you become curious about your own response before searching for another opinion. Not because outside wisdom has no value, it absolutely does. Mentors matter. Trusted friends matter. Experience matters. But there's a profound difference between seeking wisdom and surrendering your authority. One expands your perspective, the other slowly disconnects you from yourself. The invitation this week isn't to make perfect decisions. The invitation is much gentler than that. The next time you find yourself standing at a crossroads, pause. Take one slow breath. Before reaching for your phone, before asking someone else, before searching for one more article, simply ask yourself, what already feels quietly true? You may not hear a complete answer. You may only hear the faintest whisper. That's enough. Because every whisper you honor teaches your heart something it may have forgotten. I am someone who listens. And over time, the person who listens becomes the person who trusts. Not because life becomes predictable, but because the relationship with themselves becomes stronger than the uncertainty around them. This is where real freedom begins. If today's conversation resonated with you, remember that the VybeShift Podcast is where we recognize the experiences that quietly shape our lives. But recognition is only the beginning. In this week's Stage podcast, we'll go deeper into the architecture beneath self-trust and explore why our inner authority becomes so easy to surrender and how awareness allows us to reclaim it, not through force, but through congruence. If you'd like to continue your journey between episodes, explore the growing Core Problems library, where each VybeShift solving process takes one common human struggle and examines it with greater depth and practical reflection. A great place to begin is VSP number 4, I'm being pulled in too many directions at once. If your attention constantly feels fragmented and your inner voice gets drowned out by competing demands, that solving process offers a framework for reconnecting with what truly matters. You can begin here by following the link in the show notes. And if you're finding encouragement through these conversations, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the VybeShift Podcast and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. Because sometimes the greatest shift doesn't happen when we finally find all of the answers. Sometimes it begins the moment we remember that the quietest voice we've been searching for has been our own all along. Until next time, keep noticing, keep listening, and keep becoming. This is Paul Shepardson, and this has been the VybeShift Podcast.